Baxie's Musical Podcast.
Resistance is useless!
From as far back as the mid-1960s, if you had even the slightest interest in finding out about the music that lied beyond the top 40 radio countdown, you only had a couple of options. You could ask the guy working behind your nearby record store and face a stackload of scrutiny or unfair judgment. You could start hanging around in clubs, assuming you were old enough to get in. Or you could read about what was going on by picking up one of your local fanzines. Fanzines were low-budget, self-published magazines that were created to promote local or regional music scenes around the country. These publications became incredibly influential in exposing people to bands that they would never hear on the radio or bands that would eventually become radio staples. These fanzines would provide reviews, promote upcoming shows, they would run interviews, they'd talk about records and gossip and promote the newest trends, and oftentimes they would become instrumental in setting new agendas in musical taste. Fanzines like Sniffing Glue, Maximum Rock and Roll, or the Trouser Press and others were way ahead of their time throughout the 1970s and into the 80s, which brings me to today's guests. Journalist, archivist, publisher, critic, and former radio executive Ira Robbins. It's Baxie's Musical Podcast.
What is it? What is it?
It's Baxie's Musical Podcast.
Resistance is useless!
For 10 years, starting in 1974, Ira Robbins, along with Dave Schultz and the late Karen Rose, launched a fanzine known as the Transoceanic Trouser Press. It was a magazine devoted to British rock bands that they loved but were often dismissed or ignored by the American press, bands like The Who or King Crimson or Roxy Music and many others. And after several self-published editions, they simply changed the name to the Trouser Press. They also began expansion of their distribution. Suddenly, they became a sophisticated publication that was starting to shape opinion, arguably further than even Rolling Stone magazine. If you wanted to find out about Bruce Springsteen, Rolling Stone was the place to go. But if you wanted to find out about bands like The Clash or the Sex Pistols or the Ramones or bands that were actually innovating music beyond the top 40, then the Trouser Press was where you wanted to go. Ira Robbins has just released his second novel entitled Mark Bolan, Dead in an Accident, and it's available right now on Amazon. This is my conversation with Ira Robbins from the Trouser Press on Baxie's Musical Podcast.
Hi, is that better?
Oh, my God, that's so much better.
Okay, good.
That's the bad thing about cell phones. They can do everything but make a phone call. So
Yeah. I kind of amazed at how much progress we've made on this front of turning telephone calls into a garbage.
you can put a man in the moon and a reality TV star in the White House, but you cannot make a phone call on a cell phone. So,
But thank God everyone can carry one around with them now.
yes, thank goodness for that. In 1991, I'm in a record store and I come across this book on a shelf. And it's the Trouser Press Record Guide, the Ultimate Guide to Alternative Music, 4th edition. I just graduated college a few years before that, and most of what I knew of alternative music was coming from college. So this was like maybe the most important textbook I had. And I still, to this day, all the textbooks I had in college have either been thrown away, burned, or sold for peanuts. But this is like the one textbook I have to this day that I actually still open up from time to time to remind me of all this great music that I have forgotten. And I've always been amazed by how a guy can edit something like this, where you say, I got to keep this under 800 pages, otherwise it's going to go way too long. How do you edit a record guide, and what goes in and what comes out, and how do you make those decisions?
Well, okay, I did 5 of them, so each one was a little different. The first one was an outgrowth directly from Trouser Press magazine, as it was sort of winding up its 10-year run, which was in 1984. We knocked one out in 1983, and the process that one was pretty much we had reviewed in the magazine a lot of what were considered new wave albums, and so we just kind of proceeded from there. We kind of went back through the last 7 or 8 years of the magazine and figured out what we had reviewed, what we had forgotten to review, and then just kind of did it that way. So that one was easy. That was like at the time, 1983, new wave as a concept was fairly limited.
Sure.
You know, I mean, it was a thing. You could put your finger on it. You could pretty much name, the 100 most important bands. It wasn't too far flung. It was manageable. After that, it got a little more complicated. But each time, what I basically did was I would start with a list of groups, and then build under the list of groups a list of their releases, and then assign people to write about each one of them. And a lot of it was seat of the pants, I mean, it was just kind of like, did it feel like it belonged or didn't belong? Had a pretty strong anti-commercial bias in the early days, so that if a band was really successful, I could probably feel okay about leaving them out, which is why somebody like, say, Tom Petty, who briefly was sort of new wavy when he started, didn't get in there because it just didn't really feel like it belonged. And so going through each one of those, it was just a kind of what I could find people to write about, what records we could get our hands on. I mean, this is long before the streaming era, and getting records meant writing to, tiny labels in remote parts of England and asking if they could send a cassette over, so that we could review it. It was a lot of letter writing. So it was a big process. And then when we got to the fifth edition, we started over again, basically, because the up to the fourth edition, everything was kind of accumulating. We would just sort of add to what we had previously done. So it just got bigger and bigger and bigger. And, there is a limit physically on how many pages you can put in a book and still be able to sell it for a price that anybody can afford. So we basically cleared the decks. And for the 90s book, which came out, I guess, in 94,
right.
What we did was, maybe it was later, in 98, what we did was just kind of like rethink the whole thing. And, we made lists and we thought about them and we argued about them and decided what we were going to do and just sort of took it from there. So, it's a seat of the pants process. I mean, I've always admitted that, it was never meant to be perfect, but, we had kind of the Rolling Stone record guide as an example of how it could be done, and we didn't want to do it that way, because the Rolling Stone record guide started with, if it wasn't in print, they wouldn't write about it, and that to me seemed ridiculous, I mean, just because it wasn't in print didn't mean people weren't interested in it, and so we never worried about whether a record was available or easy to find or had been pressed in a quantity of 100 or 1 million. We just kind of went at it. Basically, whatever felt right to us.
Well, I think that's part of the interesting part about why I think that like magazines that start off as like fanzines and morphed into something more like the Trouser Press did. I think that's why it's so valuable, because for much of alternative music's history, it's always been about some sort of classification or some sort of you had to put it into a box. So
right.
like, if you go through I'm going through the book this morning and I'm looking at it and like I'm noticing that in 1991 you're melding everything from punk to new wave to hip hop to even Cheap Trick is in there. So I mean, like, that would be a band for me that really straddles what Tom Petty kind of straddled on early in his career. They were too weird to be rock, but too rock to be weird, and that's like one of those bands where you kind of have to make a judgment call. But yet I look at those, like the first two records, and I'm going, yeah, of course they belong in that category.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, a lot of this was at the a sensibility at the time, which it was very hard to reconstruct. And I feel bad for anybody who's like 30 years old now, who looks at this stuff and tries to imagine what connected, as you say, hip hop to punk rock to folk, indie folk to two-tone, ska, and because those differentiations have become much more concrete over the years. Yet, in the same way that when I was a kid, and I was born in the 50s, when I was a kid listening to AM radio, it was completely not there's nothing surprising about hearing Frank Sinatra back-to-back with the Tijuana Brass, the Rolling Stones, the Blues Magoos, the Beatles, and then Bob Dylan, and then, the Amboy Dukes. I mean, it was just a complete hodgepodge, and it never seemed like odd at the time. It was like, well, this is music. It's really the unfortunate evolution of modern radio over the last 40 years or so or 50 years that turned that kind of free-flowing whatever feels right, play it, into this really researched, our audience will not listen to this song if it's recorded by that person, or if it has this tempo, or if it's got this kind of a feel to it. And I guess that all kind of started somewhere between like the top 40 era and like the disco era, when stations started realizing that people would tune things out very quickly if they didn't like what they were hearing. And I've always kind of resisted that temptation. I would say that I'm very opinionated and very firm in what I value and what I don't value, but somehow in the midst of that, there's a very wide range of possibilities.
Well, I've been in radio for 30 plus years. So while I understand exactly what you're saying, because I think most people who work in radio actually feel the same way you do, but I think what radio's big problem had been back then and continues to be now is that there is a fear to play what is unknown. And if it's unfamiliar, that it feels like you can feel audience slip away. The reality is that people are always excited to find something new and always excited to have something that they feel as if it is their own. And maybe that's a large percentage or maybe it's a small percentage, but radio's always been the moment radio figured out a way to make $1 off of radio is the moment they became ultra conservative in how they approach their product, and that goes back a long, long way. What's your feeling about that idea?
Well, not to get into the weeds, but there's a very deep psychological issue here that has never really been resolved satisfactorily for my taste, which is if you hear a song that you don't know, is your first response negative or positive? And if you hear it then 100 more times, has your feeling towards it changed simply because you've heard it 100 times? I mean, look, I never liked Led Zeppelin. I just never liked Led Zeppelin. I mean, I grew up like a blues purist, and to me, Led Zeppelin were like crummy blues, right? And I know that's not a popular opinion, but that's my opinion. And I've never tried to impose it on anybody. I've just never bothered listening very much to Led Zeppelin. On the other hand, I've listened to radio my whole life, and the 10,000th time I heard "Babe, I'm Gonna Leave You" or "Whole Lotta Love" or any other standard Led Zeppelin song that I'm not going to name "Stairway to Heaven," it became familiar, and I kind of like nodded my head along with it. It's like I knew what was going to happen, and I knew where the guitar break was, and and it felt familiar, and that's a positive, right? I mean, familiarity is a very positive aspect of listening. So when you go to a concert, right, you want to sing along with the lyrics to prove to yourself that you know how the song goes, that you're not just ignoring it. At the same time, every band that's ever toured knows that the hardest thing to do is to introduce new music. People want to hear the songs that they know. And so, it's always a battle, psychological battle between what people know, already know that they like and what they might suddenly love if they heard it for the first time, or the third time. So, there's no simple answer there. It's just that it's a real battle. And I think radio has kind of chosen its side because they've chosen, as you say, the conservative view, which is, if they like it, play it. Classic rock radio, plays the same 1,000 songs. It has done for 50 years now. There's been no change in classic rock radio. Right. On the other hand, classic hits radio has migrated from the 50s into the 80s, and completely changed its perspective. So radio is a very complicated thing. I mean, I worked for iHeart for 22 years, and so, I have some familiarity with this from the inside.
Well, and that's what's so interesting about it is I think, because you have, I think programmers see, radio as having a limited window as far as the ears go. And you want to be able to maximize how many people are listening to the biggest hits of all time. And we'll ignore some of the new stuff. Maybe that's other formats we can deal with. But I think they're trying to appeal to the most amount of people in the shortest amount of time. And I think that's one of the problems that they've had. And I think that, when you look at, radio's response to, new bands like the Clash, for example. I mean, it took them an awful long time before radio would even consider playing a single Clash song. And yet it got to the point where they didn't really have much choice. And so they did. And so when a band like Nirvana comes around and it completely, kind of wipes the slate clean of all the hair metal that, I remember playing back in the 90s, it was like, that those moments have been very few and far between since that moment. It's like they just didn't know. They're always looking for the next Guns N' Roses, the next Nirvana. And that band hasn't quite arrived yet. And if it has, it hasn't arrived by using radio to get there.
Yeah, and I mean, of course, the irony is that radio plays, wants to play what it's familiar with up until the moment at which it hears something that suddenly everyone agrees is brand new, and that's what they want to play. And then all of a sudden people switch direction and they want to follow that. I mean, where was the sound of Billie Eilish, 2 years ago, right? I mean,
right.
Where was the sound of, I don't know. There've been a few of them over the years. Things that like the White Stripes. I mean, all of a sudden the White Stripes were big. I was like, this idea, like, oh wow, what a great idea. A guitarist and a drummer. It's never been done before. Well, yeah, actually, it's been done a dozen times before. You just never heard it. So there's a real paradox between what people want to redo every, just like do it again, and oh wow, we never thought of that before. That's really different. That's really great. So I mean, it was really ironic when Nirvana hit because Nirvana and I wrote the review for Rolling Stone in which I said Nirvana is another great indie rock band that'll never sell any records. Because that was the model that we had to go by, right? I mean, There'd been a lot of those bands. In my mind, up till then, I was quite familiar with where Nirvana had come from and the bands that they emulated and the bands that they played around with and stuff. And none of those bands had a prayer. And then all of a sudden, Nirvana hit, proved me obviously grossly wrong in my judgment. But at the same time, no one would have expected Nirvana to be the band that changed everything.
Yeah, no, I didn't want to have to bring up the 3-star review you did for Rolling Stone. I didn't want to bring that up, but since it's out there, but I remember. So I was at the time working for what was called an active rock station, and at the time it was Motley Crue and Winger and Dokken and those kinds of bands. And then all of a sudden the program director comes in one day and he says, "Here, we're being asked to play this, and it smells like Teen Spirit." And next to all of that music that we have been playing, here's something that is. That's a really powerful song that made everything look so foolish and stupid. And that's really how I felt playing it on the radio. Not that I felt bad playing the Nirvana. I was like, can I play this again? It was like it was such an important moment for radio to catch on to that song. And it was important for alternative music too, because it wasn't like they just started out of like they just came out of nowhere. It was like this had been kind of leading up to that moment where a band just had that right song, and that was it. That was it.
But then 2 weeks later, there's Candlebox, and you've essentially got the hair metal band from Seattle, and it went back exactly to where it had been, with the same sort of posers and cock rock strutters,
Yep.
the same thing, and it just kind of. But it looked like Nirvana. It sounded like Nirvana, but it was back to what Nirvana had essentially dispossessed, which was kind of and then you have Pearl Jam kind of like going down the middle, and and Alice in Chains, and and a bunch of other bands, and it was amazing to me how quickly that explosion kind of shifted back into what it had been before. Although, of course, it opened the doors to a lot of other things,
right?
Which is really great.
I remember a very specific conversation with the program director who is no longer with us. A record rep comes to the radio station. He's got the brand new Soundgarden album, and my boss, my program director, is listening to it and he goes, I'm not going to play this bullshit. Am I going to touch it? And yet, couple years later, all of a sudden, Soundgarden is selling, millions of records, and it kind of goes back to what we talked about before. It's like this is a band that sounded really good, had great potential, but no one wanted to take the risk of playing something that may have been unfamiliar or a little bit harder than what we were playing or something different. It's those moments are very, very rare, and Nirvana opened up the doors because as soon as they hit. All of a sudden, we're playing Soundgarden, and all of a sudden, we're playing that whole scene from Seattle. All that grunge stuff starts getting played.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's another side to it also, though, which is that a lot of this is about image. I mean, if Soundgarden had come not on A&M, with like the hair flying and stuff like that, but had been packaged by, say, Columbia, and had been sold as, like a classic rock band in the Led Zeppelin tradition, and they weren't hip, and they weren't like hanging out with, with cool kids, and they weren't making movies like Singles and stuff like that, it probably would have been a lot more palatable to mainstream radio, to active rock, to like say, oh yeah, they sound like Led Zeppelin, we can play this, because if, I don't know, in the 70s when Jimi Hendrix had died, Mahogany Rush came along, and I guess they didn't get a lot of airplay, but like no one had a problem, conceptually with the fact that they sounded exactly like Hendrix. That was their whole shtick, was that they sounded exactly like Hendrix. And Stevie Ray Vaughan. Like a lot of this stuff, it's like it's how it's positioned, how it's presented,
right?
And what people imagine it represents, which is much more complicated and very hard to control, more so than what it actually sounds like. Because if somebody in 1995, if you'd never listened to rock and roll in 1995 and gave you, say, Led Zeppelin, Soundgarden, and what was that terrible band that had a huge hit last year? The kids from the Midwest that sound exactly like Led Zeppelin.
Oh, Greta Van Fleet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And played those three records together and said, okay, you have to choose one of these to play on the radio, and the other two you'll never hear again. It would have been kind of a toss-up, right? Like you wouldn't have necessarily said, oh, these guys are the ones and these guys are fakes. It would have been like, okay, I get it. But Greta Van Fleet is like, well, geez, like, it's a little late in the day to be making this kind of music. And Soundgarden was like, well, but they're punks, so it's like, well, that's different. It's very complicated.
Right.
As you well know, the ways in which these judgments are made are not, scientific.
No, that is certainly true. It may have been at one point, but not nearly as much now. I do want to talk about the Trouser Press early on, because to me it's very interesting how fanzines and maybe music journalism has changed over the years. You guys started this in 1974. Tell me about those early years of putting this together, because it really went from a mimeographed type of thing to suddenly it's a professional looking magazine that really puts up a fight against the Rolling Stones of the world.
Yeah, it wasn't suddenly though. It was a long, slow slog. We were kids. I was 20 when we started, and we didn't know what we were doing. It was just kind of a lark, and it kind of gathered some momentum. Basically, my friend Dave Schultz and I, and our friend Karen Rose, we just all sort of really had that sort of evangelical spirit about rock and roll. It was like, if you heard a good record, you had to tell somebody about it.
Right.
It wasn't just enough to listen to it. You had to shake somebody by the lapels and say, you got to check this out. This is awesome. There's a lot of people like that, and we just simply took that and typed it on a typewriter, and so we kind of drifted into several areas that we hadn't necessarily planned or thought about, sort of the record collectors milieu, because we were writing about like British invasion bands, which really we liked. 1974, there was not a ton going on in the world of music, so, we sort of dug back into the things that we'd grown up listening to that we really cared about. So, the Stones, The Who, Jeff Beck, the Yardbirds, the Beatles, Humble Pie. It's just early stuff. Humble Pie's not so early, but, that whole sort of the Small Faces, The Move, and kind of took it from there. So we sort of delved into the collector's market, and so we kind of got connected to people who were buying and selling like imports and rare records and stuff like that, and that kind of guided us for a while. We also sort of, because we were attracted to things that were not widely popular, we kind of drifted towards like prog rock, the early days of prog rock.
Right. So
we were writing about bands like Vandergraaf Generator and Genesis, who were at the time a prog rock band, and ELP, those kinds of things. And then, 1977 comes along, and we had a British, we were all Anglophiles, and we had some British people writing for us, some guys that wrote for like the weeklies, and so they started sending us over these reports about like these incredibly crazed bands that were playing these tiny clubs, and like, people were spitting on them, and they were wearing safety pins, and they were punching each other, and they played really fast. And, so we started getting some of the records, and it was like, wow, this is awesome. And so we got really excited about, like, punk/new wave, especially the British stuff. And that kind of defined us for a long time. And then, it was just sort of a growing business. It was very hard to do. We started off with absolutely nothing. Literally, the budget for the first issue was $35. We sold it for a quarter on the street in front of the Academy of Music at a Rory Gallagher concert for a quarter a copy, by hand, just standing out there. And we just took it from there, one step at a time. We got some a record distributing company that we worked with was willing to send some copies to stores. So they would send to stores. We would bring them to stores to sell. We started getting some subscriptions. We finally had enough business going to open an office. We went to monthly. It was really, really one tiny step at a time.
Yeah, but fanzines, I think, have served an incredibly important purpose. Over the years. I grew up in Massachusetts, and I grew up in a very small town in which, if you played the Cars or Tom Petty, you were listening to real hardcore stuff. And it wasn't until I went to college, and I went to the college in Milwaukee, and it didn't have a huge scene, but at the time, the Violent Femmes were out,
sure.
and
Kreutzen.
De Kreutzen, yep. In fact, my old roommate worked at a record store that Keith from De Kreutzen used to work at, so we got to know those guys, and then all of a sudden we were following them around, and I'm starting to learn a whole lot more, in the mid '80s, mid to late '80s, and one of the things I remember is picking up a copy of Rock and Roll, Maximum Rock and Roll, which was a fanzine out of Chicago. And
No, L.A.
L.A. Thank you. And yet I'm looking at these things and seeing these bands I've never heard of, but it would just seem so freaking exciting to reading about these things. The fanzines that went around early on, I think they changed people's tastes. I think people were like dying to find out something new that wasn't the Eagles, it wasn't Skynyrd, it wasn't Bruce Springsteen. And the importance of that, I think, is immeasurable to so many of these bands that might not have gotten noticed otherwise.
I agree. I think what fanzines served as in those days was as kind of like the newsletters of clubs that didn't exist. Because if you subscribe to Matter out of Chicago or Conflict out of Boston or New York Rocker or Trouser Press or
right.
Bomp or Slash or 100 other magazines like them, you sort of became part of a group. It was like a Facebook group, right? I mean, like all of a sudden you had a point of connection with other people who thought the same way as you did. And the fanzines guided people towards things to be interested in. They kind of set the tone, but each one had its own aesthetic, its own clique, its own, sort of view of the world. And the ones that really kind of did a good job really brought people together in a way that, that social media now does. But, in those days, there was nothing even remotely like that to do so. So I think they really did kind of like focus people. And, you could kind of go to a concert and you go like, oh, I just read about this band and such. It's like, I read about them too. Yeah. Let's be friends. So it was it was a hookup, right? I mean, it was a way of joining people together around common interests, and I think it was really, really valuable. I mean, a lot of the fanzines were crap. I mean, for sure. I mean, a lot of people did one or two issues and then gave up. But the ones that really kind of put their backs into it, I mean, Slash ended up a label.
Yep.
Forced Exposure, became, a label as well. Boston Rock, which, was an outgrowth of Modern Music, the store chain. I mean, the big thing that was happening also around fanzines was the DIY industry. That a lot of things cropped up to take care of the business that bands that had no hope of ever being on a major label needed. Booking agencies, publicity firms, pressing plants, clubs, labels, the whole 9 yards of the business essentially sprang up, sort of with fanzines as sort of the communications valve.
I think that's exactly what happened. But if you look at I look at things, the way they've progressed now, and it's, to me, it's not the same. The internet has served a great purpose in a lot of ways, but Stereo Gum or Stereo Lab or whatever the hell it is, that's not exactly what you were doing. It's more clickbait focused today than it was, than about sharing in a communal love of a singular band. It's very, very different. I mean, do you feel that music journalism has suffered over the years as a result of the internet, or has it improved it?
I'm on the suffered side. I mean, but not necessarily for the reasons that you say. I mean, I think that the problem that's arisen, there's two problems that have arisen. One is that, the internet makes everybody a fanzine editor, the first time they get a phone. Everybody can share an opinion. They can, report things. They can write articles. They can review concerts. They can do everything they want to do without ever even going to the trouble of creating, an identity in a magazine or, even a digital magazine. You're just kind of like, well, here's my dumb opinion. So I think that has both brought, a wider variety of people into the field, but also removed the barriers for people, who have no talent whatsoever. They're part of it as well. I think the other factor that to me is more crucial is the change in the cultural views over the years of what it's how critics deal with their audiences and how publications deal with their audiences. I trace it all back to USA Today. That USA Today was the first major publication that I'm aware of that did everything it could to make it easy for their readers to follow them. It was really, I'm not going to use the word dumbed down because it wasn't dumb. It was just simplified. And, the idea was always, what can we do to make this acceptable to readers? And at that point, journalism, and I've seen this in 100 publications, from the top to the bottom, like a magazine like Entertainment Weekly could be accused of the same thing, that, what happened really was this fear of alienating the readership, and so that kind of turned into this sort of obligation to be more positive than negative, to be simpler, to not tell people things that they don't already know, to not challenge people. It was one of our watchwords when we were doing Trouser Press, that if we found a word we really liked and it was really, uncommon or obscure, we didn't go like, we're not going to use that word, it's too obscure. And we didn't go like, oh, here's the definition of this word, so you don't have to look it up. We just assumed people would figure it out. That's what dictionaries are for, I was raised, to read. And I always knew that if I didn't know a word, I'd look it up. There was a thing in grade school where there was literally a button that they gave us, a badge, that said, "We never ask, we look it up." It was basically promoting dictionary use. And so I think the point at which magazines began fearing their readers and trying to be, it's the same phenomenon essentially as what we discussed with radio. It was like the not turning anybody off idea. That's where journalism in music and film and other areas became too intimidated by their readership to have really strong, courageous, unpopular opinions. And so I think that's what's happened. I think what's happened on, what you see on Twitter now and things like that is sort of a reaction to that. You get people, saying, here's my hot take for today, the Beatles were never any good, which is, the kind of thing that we might have written in Trouser Press, but we didn't, but now it doesn't get into publications. It just gets into people's Twitter feeds.
But and the sick part about it, this is the part that really pisses me off, is I fall for it every single time. Obviously there's some sort of psychological ploy that they figured out that if it tells me here are the top 10 drummers of all time, I'm going to go on like, well, I got to find out if my favorite drummers are on that list. and it's how I fall for it, and I know better, and I know I shouldn't do it, but damn it, I do it every single time. It's impossible to walk away from it. So you've written your second novel, the Mark Bolan Killed in Accident, a musical novel for the 1970s. Tell us about the motivation to write another novel.
Well, after doing music journalism for 50 years, I kind of feel like I've said a lot of what I ever wanted to say about music. You get older, it's harder to stay in tune with what people are interested in. It's hard to keep up with stuff. The days of, me opening the mailbox every day to 30 new records is long gone. And so, I don't feel that I necessarily have the cachet or the knowledge to really, write about contemporary stuff, so I don't. And yet, I've been a writer since I was, 11 years old, and so it's not really something that I'm going to stop doing. And I found fiction to have a lot of opportunity, of creative thought and exploration and kind of self-examination and things like that. And so what I wanted to do with this novel, Mark Bolan Killed in Crash, is to sort of put myself mentally into the glam rock era in London in 1972. I've always really loved glam rock. I love all those bands, T-Rex and Slade and Roxy Music and Bowie and Sweet and all the Rubinoos and stuff like that. Not the Rubinoos, sorry, I'm drawing a blank. Mud, all those bands, and so Wizard, and so I thought it would be fun to just create a character and put her there, and then have her become, and she's a 15-year-old schoolgirl who has no connection to anything. She's just a timid little kid whose mom has been killed in a car crash, and she's living with her dad. And through a weird series of circumstances, she becomes sort of the research arm for this fading rock star named Chaz Bonaparte, whose manager thinks he's really lost touch and doesn't really know who his audience is. And so essentially what we're talking about is exactly what we were talking about with radio. It's like his manager thinks he needs to do some audience research and to test some songs out.
Right.
And so he asks this girl to tell him what people want to hear, what her peers would be interested in hearing songs about. And that's sort of what gets the plot rolling.
We talked a little bit about the Nirvana review that you gave a few years ago. And yeah, again, I don't want to point out that you gave it only 3 stars, but you brought it up first. So
but to be completely fair, I didn't assign the number of stars, so I won't take credit for that.
All right. Okay, so I'll let that slide. But nevertheless, I have to believe that over the years, with all the things you've written, that there have to have been a couple of records. Because I know for me, there have been a couple of records I've received. I heard it the first time, going, I'm not so sure I get it. And then I go back to it maybe a year later, maybe 2 years later, and all of a sudden it's like, geez, how did I miss that? How has this been in my collection for all that time, and I never went back to it? This, I assume, there has to have been a couple of moments where you said, I wish I could take that one back, or I wish I could give that one another look because now I finally get it. Yeah,
there have been. I mean, but it's not so much what I thought about them as what I wrote about them. I mean, I'm in the middle of working on kind of a project that I'm going to self-publish later this year, which is a sort of a memoir combined with an anthology of my writing. And so it's kind of like what I published and what I was thinking about when I did it. And I've been looking back over stuff that I haven't read in 40 years and found some real howlers. Some stuff where whatever it was that I now think of this record, it didn't get there in the review. I mean, I found a review of the first Clash album that I wrote in Trouser Press.
Right.
And it's pretty bad. I mean, it's just a piece of kind of slapped off, whipped off kind of like, these guys are great, really love the way they sing, songs are great, really like them, they're cool. But with absolutely no perspective or perception or thought or analysis or anything. And I'm thinking, this is a record that I loved at the time, that I've listened to regularly for 40 some odd years, and that's all I could think of to say about it at the time. It's kind of like you remember the time you met, your future wife or something like that, and what you said to her was like, wow, those are ugly sneakers, right? I mean, really, that was my opening line. So I've had a few of those. I mean, I definitely rethought the whole album after a while. I think it's one of those records that I went back and rewrote the review on the Trouser Press Record Guide on the website because it was really I misappraised it. I thought the first time.
Yeah,
I think it's a really good record.
And are there? I also assume on the opposite side there are some records that you heard the first time around that you still love today. What would you say would be some of your favorites?
I mean, the ones that I love, I still love. I just can't listen to all of them anymore. I mean, I've been listening to The Who since I was 12 years old, and I can't remember the last time I pulled Tommy out and put it on the turntable. It's like, or on the CD player, and then I've got probably 8 different copies of it. It's like it just would never occur to me because I know it so well. But it's funny. Here's one. I happened to read recently the Mark Lewison book on the Beatles, the first of his 3-volume set, which he's only written 1 volume of.
Right.
It's 1,000 pages long, and it ends with Ringo joining the band and them recording their first single. So basically, it's 1,000 pages of lead up, right? and I'm thinking, I didn't want to read it. My wife bought it. It was on the shelf for 3 or 4 years, and I'm like, I'm not interested in this. I know everything I need to know about the Beatles. And then, I was kind of like, well, I'm in lockdown here. I got nothing better to do. I need something to really sink my teeth into. I'll read it. So I read it. And at the end of it, I had to listen to a bunch of Beatles stuff again. So I pulled out like the what is it called, Great Tracks or something like that. It's like it's 3 discs of like rarities and stuff, weird albums that came out, and it's like, okay, this is strange. I mean, it just was a very odd experience to listen to music that I've known since I was 10. And kind of relive it a little bit. And some of it was kind of surprising to me. But, a lot of this stuff I just know in my head so well that I never even listen to it anymore. But, there's still plenty of records that I go back to. I mean, I'm still stuck on, like, the Jesus and Mary chain. So
The first one?
Yeah, that one or Darklands. I mean, I just go back and forth. And, a lot of that stuff, the stuff I listen to at home is for fun. It's kind of all over the place. But, I don't know, this is a New England thing. I listen to a lot of the Queers. Do you know them?
Yep.
From New Hampshire. I'm in the middle of writing liner notes for a Ramones reissue for the end of the century, so I've been listening to a lot of Ramones lately. But yeah, I mean, it's music kind of, once you listen to it as much as, people like you and I have, you have a lot of it in your head. You don't really have to play it. And playing music for fun, after you've spent decades playing it for work, it's a little tricky.
It's funny. I've with the advent of eBay and Amazon, I go back and I try to find as much stuff that is used online as I can get. So after for 20 years of my first marriage, not buying anything, now I'm finally starting to integrate stuff that I wanted, and finally I'm getting now. And then what I'm finding now that I'm remarried is now I've had 2 wives looking to find places for all my records and CDs, saying there must be a place that you can shelter these from people so we don't have to look at them.
I'm getting some of the funny looks lately of like, why do we have a cellar full of records again? Yeah, I mean, we could build a dark room down there, couldn't we?
Yeah, we probably could. You probably could. I know. For me, I'm so tired of moving them from room to room, from place to place, from state to state, that I just want one place for them to be forever, like it's my own private library.
Yeah, no, it's great. I mean, I've been indexed. One of the lockdown things I've been doing is, the website Discogs.com.
I do, yeah.
They have a collection function, and so you can scan your records by barcode. And so I've started, trying to put my whole collection in there, but it's going to take years. But I've been working on the compilations, and so far I've done 1,300 compilation CDs.
Yeah, isn't that really an illness? I mean, we should both be on like an episode of Hoarders together, where they have to remove us by taking a wall out of the house to take all our records out.
The only good thing about it is that they do tell you how much your collection is worth, which is kind of helpful, right? Because at some point I'm going to look at it and go, really? Really? And the thought of kind of doing something about it is going to suddenly become more appealing.
Yeah, I know. And there's some like I bought for like $2. I'm like, honey, it was only $2. How could I not buy my third version of The Crack by the Ruts? How could I not have that? I need that. It's in the house. I just
had to order a Ron Wood solo album from some guy in Sweden because I was looking through Discogs.com and it said that I had written liner notes for it. This reissue of a Ron Wood album, and I'm like, I did?
Did you?
And I literally have no idea, so I ordered it so I could just see what it is.
You would think that if Ron Woods was having a solo album and asked you to do the liner notes, you would have recalled that.
Yeah, I mean, I have a list of all the liner notes I've done. I'm up to 49, but that one I don't have on my list. So the only thing I can think is I once wrote a bio for Columbia for one of his solo records, like back in the days when I took that kind of work. I did a bio, and maybe that's what they used or something, or maybe it's just some quote from something I once wrote about him that they took without asking and gave me credit for. So who knows?
The name of the book is Killed in Crash. Mark Bolan, Killed in Crash, a music novel of the 1970s. Sorry, I butchered the the title earlier, but that is the name of the.
It's available on Amazon.
Yep.
Not in bookstores. Only on Amazon. As loath as I am to plug Amazon, they actually are publishing it. So
it is what it is.
The deal.
It is what it is. I appreciate the time today. It's been a real pleasure talking to you.
Great. Thank you so much.
Again, Ira Robbins' new book is available on Amazon. And by the way, make sure you check out Baxy's Musical Fun Bag every Sunday night at 9 o'clock Eastern Time on Rock 102, rock102.com, or on the TuneIn Radio app for classic punk, vintage, alternative, and old new wave. You can also get a hold of me at bax@rock102.com. I appreciate you listening to the show.